Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your sociology instructor. If the backdrop behind me looks a little bit different, it's because I'm back at work and I'm in my office making these videos. In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about two types of poverty: absolute poverty and relative poverty. What do you think of when you think of someone being poor? What picture comes to mind? Do you see yourself possibly? Do you see a homeless person on the streets in a city in the United States? Do you see somebody in a poor country somewhere else in the world? What image comes to mind? One of my students asked me if I was poor when I was a child, and I had to think about it, and my answer was I didn't think about myself as being poor, but I did think of myself as not having some of the stuff that my peers took for granted. When I was young, my parents did not allow me to take any lessons or be involved in sports because there wasn't room in their budget for the fees or the uniforms that were involved. There also wasn't an extra car that could be used to transport me to lessons, and that one car that we had was used to go to work for my father. We also lived in a single-wide trailer for a while I was in high school, and I didn't get any help from my family to pay for college. I didn't get any help from the government either, but all of those things made me realize that I didn't have quite the financial backing that other people my age had. But again, I didn't really consider myself being poor. When we think of poverty, there are two types of poverty that are used in sociology. The first is called absolute poverty. And absolute poverty means not meeting the minimal requirements necessary to sustain a healthy existence. So if you are in absolute poverty, you don't have enough food to meet the basic nutritional requirements. You don't have clean water. You don't have basic sanitation. You might not have a house to live in or any type of shelter. Your basic requirements to stay alive are not in place. Believe it or not, there are many people in the world who live in absolute poverty. In our country, there's less or little absolute poverty. The type of poverty that we see in the United States is more likely to be relative poverty. Relative poverty is defined according to the living standards of the majority in any given society. So if you don't have what other people take for granted, you're living in relative poverty. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have the latest iPhone. It doesn't mean you don't live in a mansion. It means you don't have the stuff other people take for granted. The majority of the people living in a society do have shelter. They do have reliable transportation. They do have clothing. They have education. If you don't have those things that other people take for granted, you're living in relative poverty. So the pictures I've chosen for this slide are a beater car and a single-wide home, much like the one I lived in when I was in high school or a high school senior. So I want to ask you a question. How about the underclass who are homeless in America? This one is on the border of absolute poverty and relative poverty because the homeless don't have adequate shelter. They may not have basic nutrition, but there's a safety net in our country. The picture I chose for this slide is from a homeless shelter in the community where I live. The Religious Community Services, a network of many different churches in the area where I live, have one shelter where there is a food bank, where there is a homeless shelter. This puts the homeless more into the category of relative poverty than absolute poverty because there is a safety net. Not a great one, but a safety net to help them meet their basic needs. On the other hand, I've had some students who could not afford a smartphone of any type, internet at home. They had to rely on either the school or the library. They didn't have reliable transportation. If they had a car, it was constantly breaking down or was already broken down and they couldn't afford a repair. And some of my students here in the South lived in homes that did not have any air conditioning. Ask yourself, what type of poverty were they experiencing? If you said the answer is relative poverty, you would be correct. My students were living in relative poverty. They had the basics to meet human needs to exist, but they didn't have those things that the rest of us took for granted, that the majority of people who live in this area have. So in this mini lecture, we looked at absolute poverty, where there is not enough to sustain life, and relative poverty, where you don't have what the majority takes for granted.